So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending this webinar. Just to advise you that we are recording this webinar and we'll be putting the recording online at a later stage. So subject identifiers in the UK Federation is our topic today. I'm John Agland in the Trust and Identity team, and I'm joined by a number of my colleagues in the Trust and Identity team at JISC who will be no doubt making interjections throughout the today. So, subject identifiers in the Federation. The background we're going to run through. So this is the overview of what we're going to run through today. The background is what are they? What are the existing ones that we're using? The new standard that has been announced and about 2 years ago, and any problems with the existing identifiers in the Federations, talking about that. Then we'll get on to supporting the new standard as an IDP. So what do IDP operators need to do? And that's going to be the first thing that needs to happen in the majority of cases. Following that, supporting the new standard as a service provider. And then we'll also talk about supporting the new standard as a Federation operator. There are things that we need to do that will run alongside some of this, but also will need to happen before some of this can move forward. So what are subject identifiers? Well, the simplest thing here is to just break down those two words, isn't it? Subject, a personal thing that is being discussed, described, or dealt with. And then an identifier, a personal thing that identifies someone or something. Existing subject identifiers in the Federation. So this is what we have currently within the UK Federation. It's based on the EduPerson schema. The EduPerson schema has been around for about 18 years, and the key attributes that we are using for identifying subjects in the Federation, there are two. So the first is the EduPerson target ID. This is an abstracted version of the Saml 2 name identifier, so the persistent format that's listed there. It's unique per IDP, SP, and user relationship. The identity provider generates this typically based on a source attribute value and a salt, and generates this every time a different user logs into a different service. And is therefore a pseudonym. It's not a, it doesn't contain itself personal information, although it may be classed as personal information. The EduPerson principal name then is a scoped identifier for a person. It's usually represented in the form of user at scope. So it appears and looks like an email address to many people and many applications, but it isn't actually an email address, and it shouldn't be treated as that. So it defines where user is a name-based identifier for the person. And then the scope defines a namespace. That's typically a domain name. So, like I said, these do very much look like email addresses to people observing them. The assigned identifiers must be unique. What we typically see with the first one, the EduPerson targeted ID, is this is released widely within the Federation, and then there's more control over the release of EduPerson principal name, often because it contains personal information as well, because it might say joe.blogs or something like that. So the link there to the EduPerson schema, and there's been several revisions of the EduPerson schema as well over the years. So further identifiers that might be in use in the Federation, EduPerson name, EduPerson principal name prior is multi-valued, but only one SP has this in their requested attributes. This is a block of information that we use to describe what attributes a particular service provider supports, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. EduPerson unique ID. This appeared in 2013 in the EduPerson schema. Very low take-up of this from what we can see. The indication is that 59 SPs have requested attributes for this. Those are mostly imported from EduGain. Only one of those is directly registered in the UK Federation. So using requested attributes as an indicator, and it is a bad indicator because we know that you'll see at the bottom there I've mentioned that not many SPs have this in their metadata. But if we look at that, we see that 674 have EduPerson targeted ID mentioned, and 1,269 have EduPerson principal name mentioned. Now, The reason it's a bad indicator is not just that it doesn't appear in the metadata for all service providers, but also that the default policy advises release of both of these. But sorry, not both of these, but so particularly EduPerson targeted ID to SPs, and EduPerson principal name might be released on a per case basis that we're not aware of. So it's not a great indicator. And also requested attributes came along a bit later, so people didn't have them in their registrations, and that hasn't always been added in. So existing subject identifiers in Saml. So these do appear in the federation, but they're also used outside of the federation, typically in the subject of the Saml assertion. And there's three formats there that are typically used: persistent, transient, and email address. Now, persistent is the same thing that we're using in the EduPerson targeted ID attribute, effectively. But an IDP in the federation will typically release the transient a transient identifier in the subject, which will change per sort of session or whatever, and a persistent in the Saml attribute, the EduPerson targeted ID. And of course, I've mentioned email address in this last one, so let's address the white elephant, which is email address as an identifier. Email address is not a great identifier. It's not guaranteed unique to a subject. So, let's use that example. Their service at UK Federation. Which person is that? Is that myself? Is that any of the team who support the UK Federation? It may be reassigned. So, prior to this, I worked at a university. The vice chancellor always had an email address that was VC@ that they used. They probably had a personal one as well. But who does that? Which person does that belong to? Because that role changes. And also, common names. Names get reused. They shouldn't be reused within a time frame, but they might be reused later on. And life events or affiliations may change it. So people get married or change names, and affiliations change between people, which may dictate this. So somebody might be a postgraduate student and then becomes a staff member, and their email address changes as part of that. It's not always assigned by the institution. So, it's entirely possible to have other email addresses on other systems. Email's been around for a very long time. People have multiple email addresses, and some organizations might just be gathering email address information based on what the user already has, rather than actually allocating them an email address. It may not be validated. So it won't be validated typically in that process. So receiving it in a Saml federation, you can't trust it. You have to do some extra validation steps, which completely falls outside of the whole federated process. So there's a link there with some of those more details on that from the In Common Federation on why email address is not an appropriate user identifier. So that goes into a bit more detail. Here and our war story on this is that we've had a very similar situation to this occur with a bilateral SP that we've had to deal with, where email address was used as the identifier because that's what the supplier said they wanted. There was some resistance, can't we use a better identifier, etc., etc. And what then happens is that at some point somebody made another change and said, hang on, we can change email addresses and we can let people change their email addresses based on their name changes and all of that. And then they suddenly decide that actually this isn't the great attribute that we could use. And we had to very quickly turn this around because they were trying to deal with inconsistencies in something that was effectively financial because they didn't have the correct set of data and they had to reconcile all that data. And I can tell you where we went with that. We went to employee number as the attribute that was needed in that scenario. So the new standard is Saml subject identifier. So there's two new Saml attributes defined in a new standard. The link to the new standard there. So the first one is the subject ID. The idea is that this is a person and identifies a person. It can be reused between services and isn't unique per service. So very, very similar to what you have for EduPerson principal name right now. there is alignment with EduPerson unique ID within the standard. It recognizes that is there and is potentially is good practice. The pairwise ID then, very, very similar to the EduPerson targeted ID in the way that it's generated per user service provider relationship, and obviously per identity provider, but it's not quite as clear as that because it uses the scope. So therefore, multiple identity providers that are asserting the same scope could be using that same attribute. For anyone who's been here a long time, they'll probably notice and been involved in Saml and federations for a long time. You'll go, hang on, this looks familiar. This looks very much like what we did for Saml 1, the EduPerson schema there, and what may be configured in your IDPs as EduPerson targeted ID.old. Yes, it is, but review the problem statement in the standard and you'll realize why it's not quite the same. And we will go on to this a little bit later on in this presentation. So the drivers for the Saml subject identifiers. So the new standard that's been ratified for over over 2 years, and use cases are coming. The EduPerson 2020-01 revision marked it as deprecated, so it will be marked as obsolete in a future version of this specification. So we need to follow the standards. New refeds RNS, so research and scholarship version 2 entity category. So the current RNS that people use in the Federation is version 1.3. That allows release of additional attributes containing personalization to similar services that support the research and scholarship agenda and are often collaborative in their nature. So moving on to that consultation for version 2 is nearing consultation. In that consultation, it will be requiring the new Saml subject identifier, and I think that is where that is aiming to go. So I think that says to us very clearly that research-intensive organizations need to start supporting the new standard probably sooner than other organizations. That doesn't mean you can't all start to support it now, but very much that's where the priority will need to be. So yeah, EduPerson targeted ID is dead. Long live EduPerson targeted ID, because you can't just move from one standard to another. There are competing standards. You're always, you introduce a new standard. It doesn't remove all the previous standards. You now have more. And see AC chargers, and I think this was pre-USB connectors, but we'll add USB connectors to that one as well. And now we can add subject identifiers to that. So one of the existing problems, and this will be where I'm answering the issue that, hey, haven't I seen this before, is that existing identifiers may be using case-sensitive values. So existing Shibboleth IDPs, typically they will be using base 64 in either their computed ID or stored ID connectors to generate those per user, per service provider, per identity provider values that then go into the EduPerson targeted ID. So the example there, how does an SP handle this scenario where one is one case and one is the other case, but the same value? If they don't handle that well, we've got a problem. So, and it's not just down to the service provider software, the Saml service provider software, it's also down to the end application, which is an even wider mix of things. So newer Shibboleth IDP deployers should be using base 32. That's our advice. If you're starting afresh, use base 32. SPs can test with the UK Federation test IDP. So we have accounts called Yanni and Laurel. If you're wondering where that came from, there's a video on the internet for somebody saying Yanni and Laurel, and or so they say a phrase and different people hear it as either Yanni or Laurel. So that's where we got that from. But we have those test accounts. They do a very similar thing to that. They release the same value, but one in one case, one in another case. And if you identify as the same user in that particular system, then there is a problem if you've used those two different accounts. Okay, so I have set up some polls. I'm wondering if I'm going to be able to get access to these. I can see the polls. Okay, so 2 questions for IDPs. So we'll start with that. Let's see how this goes. Okay. There you go. Right, let's start launching that poll. So I'll give us about a minute or so to answer those questions. I will run through those questions and read them out as well. So how are you deriving EduPerson targeted ID? So what we want to understand is what is the source attribute that you currently use for that? And then the same question for EduPerson principal name. Remember, EduPerson targeted ID will be going through a computed connector or a stored connector, most likely. EduPerson principal name is likely to be a direct mapping to that value. And yeah, it's good. We're getting some answers in. So we've got about 18 or 39 at the moment. I'll give it 10 more seconds and then I'll end the poll. Okay, so there's the poll results. So definitely a bit of a mixed bag. Clearly a difference between how you handle EduPerson targeted ID versus EduPerson principal name. Can everyone see the results? Has it brought that up for everyone? So we're looking about 27% using the object GUID or object SID, an attribute or an attribute generated by the directory service for EduPerson targeted ID, but 22% using something based on the user's first name or surname, or something UID, SAM account name, user principal name, etc. Attribute based on an organization identifier, like an employee number or student number, 37%, and then 22% put other. How are we deriving? Oh, I've got a share results button. That would help, wouldn't it? How are we deriving EduPerson principal name? What is the source attribute? So what is it? Attribute generated by the directory service. That's much lower, 6%, but higher for 58% for user's first name, surname, such as UID, SAM account name, 32% using based on an organization identifier, and then 6% other. So yeah, that's a good spread. So okay, let's move on to the next slide. So supporting the Saml subject identifiers IDPs. So is it time for a fresh start is the question here, because if you're using existing computed ID connector which uses base 64, then you probably should, because the new standard very much suggests that something encapsulated within base 32. So it doesn't have to be all of base 32, but that's your outer boundary effectively. So using base 32 would be a good choice at this point. It's also a chance to change the source attribute. So those attributes we've talked about there in the poll, object GUID, object SID, these tie you heavily into Microsoft Active Directory, and binary attributes are tricky to handle. We've seen that in the if you've seen recent announcements from us, you know, that comes to light in people doing upgrades and things, that the binary attributes are tricky to handle. UID, SAM account name, user principal name, CN, mail, or potentially affected by change of name or affiliation with the organization, or you know, any other change you might make. So they can be tricky. Employee, student, and student number. I'm pleased that, you know, there's sort of 37% on the first one and 32% on the second one in those results that show that people are using those. And on the face of it, I think that's a really great choice as a source for pairwise ID, because, you know, they should stay with that person for their duration with that organization. Now, the question that isn't answered is what source for subject ID. That might be more tricky. So 2 more questions for you, another poll, which is effectively, in light of what we're talking about here and what I've talked about on the last slide, what would you now consider for subject ID and pairwise ID? So let me close that poll and then open the new poll. I'll relaunch the poll. No. Oh, okay. Oh, that's interesting. Sorry, I'm having some fun. It's okay. I think I've captured the results, so I've certainly read the results out.
I took some pictures.
Yeah, okay. So I've put it onto the new attributes one now. So there's the questions there, so I'll read through them. What source attribute would you use for subject ID? Now, this is effectively very similar to what you use for eduperson principal name, in the sense that it would be shared to multiple organizations, multiple service providers. It wouldn't be unique per user service provider relationship, unlike pairwise ID. Pairwise ID would be something you would have to use the computed ID connector for. And again, I'll give the result sort of another sort of 45 seconds from here to run through the poll. So okay, so I'm going to end the poll in 10 seconds. Okay, share the results. Okay, so this is the next set of results. So as you can see, what source for subject ID, many still hankering around user's first name, surname. So 8 or 50%. A lot, there's definitely been a bit of an increase there of people thinking, well, actually employee number, student number would be a better choice here. That's good. I think that, that is the choice there that could work. Pairwise ID, a significant number now on, 57% saying that they would use that. And, that I think that's where we need to be going with this. 25% using attribute based on the user's first name or surname. Okay, stop sharing those results. Okay, so signaling. So we talked about requested attributes previously. SPs signaling what attributes they require or support using requested attributes. That facility is there. However, the language is very, very primitive. Existing requested attributes, you can't say things like, I'd like this one attribute, but if you don't have that, I'd like this one. Or I'd like that one, please. So we can't do that thing of falling through from eduperson principal name to eduperson target ID to mail. You can only say, I require these and these are optional. So you can say, I need eduperson principal name, but first name and surname would be optional or something like that. You can't make this these logical statements, ands or ors or anything like that. So the new entity category has options of pairwise ID, subject ID, any or more. So this is, instead of using requested attributes, there's an entity category that service providers will need to have on their metadata, which will signal to the identity provider what attribute to release. So it'll very much come down to the service provider to dictate that. So whether they suggest none, any, subject ID or pairwise ID. Now, I can't see any problem with pairwise ID, any or none. Subject ID, though, how do IDP operators feel about subject ID being auto-released? I think, that might be more problematic if that has personal information in there. And, I can see that 50% said that they would choose user's first name or surname in that subject ID. The other thing to note is that even if the output isn't personal information, doesn't have personally identifiable information in it, it could and would usually be personal information still. Will you be using an attribute containing personal information? Well, as we've said, there's clearly a sign there. So a very, very quick poll on subject identifier and personal information. Let me relaunch the poll for that one. Okay, so will you be using an attribute containing personal information for subject ID? I'll give this one just to a minute because it's only one question. Okay, so I'll pull this one in 10 seconds. Oh, well, I'm sure you'll love these results because we've basically got nothing clear apart from lots of people sitting on the fence, which I guess is probably a good place to be, is to certainly go away and think about this. Some not applicable, possibly just the poll isn't applicable in this circumstance, but yeah, I think concern for those who are suggesting they might use personal information and then might need to be cautious. So we'll discuss this as we're going through the slides now. So a quick foray onto entity IDs versus scopes. So existing Saml attributes are tied based on the entity ID, which is another problem that we have, because that means that if you want to change the entity ID, you can't very easily do that. Now, deployment of the new Saml subject identifiers, it will eventually free us from the tie of the entity ID, but how long that migration goes on for, we don't know. It's open-ended, isn't it? So it will tie us into the scope instead, because we'll have to rely on that scope as the means of identifying. In the meantime, you'll be tied to both because of that. However, aren't we already? Probably you're already using scope for authorization with EduPerson's scoped affiliation. So I don't think it shackles us any more than we already are. Scopes, a single scope can be asserted by multiple IDPs, and that would be, that can already be done with EduPerson principal name, but now that will be possible with EduPerson targeted ID. Sorry, not EduPerson targeted ID. Sorry, but with the new Saml pairwise ID and the subject identifier, both of those will be scoped. So you could in theory release the same values from multiple IDPs. IDPs can assert multiple scopes, so depending on their software / configuration. So it's doable easily within a Shibboleth IDP. Scopes and the domains they represent are verified for compliance with our metadata registration practice statement. So if you're registering those within the UK Federation, then we are checking them to make sure that they are owned by the relevant organisation, or that if they're not, that organisation has the right to use them. So this is a bit about the Shibboleth IDP configuration. This is what it looks like at the moment. If you go into version 4.10, so an example from the attribute resolver just shows the mappings there. So the Saml subject ID, the Saml pairwise ID, the Saml subject ID, a direct mapping to an attribute. As you can see there, it's in a placeholder to the value that's set for IDP persistent ID dot source attribute. You could change that. Probably will need to change that if that's going to differ. Attribute, the pairwise ID is the completed ID connector, but as discussed, you might need a second completed ID connector. So you might want one that's computed ID connector hyphen pairwise, computed ID connector hyphen edgy person targeted ID, so that you know that they're different. The attribute filter, now this is quite interesting because that effectively says that the pairwise ID will be released whenever anyone asks for pairwise ID or any, based on that earlier entity category that we discussed. The subject ID will be released on only if the subject ID is listed in there. But that if that contains personal information, you might be concerned and you might need to add some additional logic similar to what you might have for edgy person principal name right now, which just deals with that scenario of having a list of entities that you support this for. So this is all per 3.5.1 of the new standard. So if you read the standard document, you'll see that that's in there. So the SP configuration is quite light for the service providers, and we're going to start creeping into the discussion about service providers now. Edgy person principal name is the first one used in the remote user attribute. So if you've got that, and then you've got the subject ID, the pairwise ID, and persistent ID. So it follows in that order. It takes the first one, and that means it can vary based on what user and what the identity provider is releasing. And it also appears in the attribute map if it doesn't appear in yours. But if you build a new V3, it will appear in there. But obviously, you could retrofit these to V2 or early V3 or whatever if they're not in the config already. So supporting the Saml subject identifiers SPs. So if you don't have any personalization, there's effectively nothing to worry about because the identifiers will change. There's possibly one thing, which is just reporting. Reporting may show more unique users because the identifier changes. But, you know, that's it. However, if you are doing personalization, then there's quite a conundrum here to solve. The problem of mapping X to Y is going to be quite complex. So you're mapping two completely disparate values to one another. And so it's going to need coordination between IDP and SP to achieve that. You might need to share and log the recent assertion ID to aid this process. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because IDPs can generate the value if they know what the attribute of the user is or which user logged in. But it's more difficult and not necessarily always logged what the actual values are for this. So the assertion ID will give them something very clear to look for in their log files to be able to then map to a user and then be able to generate each respective value, because you can only generate these values if you know the inputs. You can't reverse them. So you need to know what the source, the service provider's entity ID, the user's value, the user value, whatever that is, whatever attribute you're using as the source, and the salt. And if you don't have those, you can't create the values. Now, attribute priority, you know, you've seen that in the Shib SP config that I showed earlier, the remote user attribute. That's done at a service provider level, but it might need to be done per customer because different customers might now have different priorities that they need. So that's something to consider. In the Shib SP, the remote user might not be the best attribute to be using. So if you're only supporting that, you might want to start using the attributes themselves and then taking that logic somewhere else into an application or something like that that deals with it. So supporting the Saml subject identifiers in the SP, again, building a new SP. So if you're building one today, if I was deploying an SP today, what would I do? What scenarios would I take? Well, I'd go subject ID or fall back to edgy person principal name if I needed these defined names of people for an allow list or something like that. If it was more general and anyone with an identifier, then I'd go pairwise ID and edgy person targeted ID. But if I've got a tricky application that really I wanted, I was happy to use edgy person target ID, but the format doesn't really fit. And this is one of the issues you can have with some applications, is that they don't cope well with the value, can't handle the URLs being in the value for a user or something like that. They're expecting a username or an email address at most sort of format. Well, in that scenario, I'd say use pairwise ID and fall back to edgy person principal name in that scenario for IDPs who haven't yet deployed. So supporting the Saml subject identifiers, the UK Federation, what do we need to do? So there's not masses we need to do, but this is the page of that we've got so far, but we would appreciate thoughts on this. So build the new entity category support in our tooling so that the SPs can signal their support. Set up IDP test accounts that release pairwise and subject ID. That's fairly routine. We can do that. Test SP and attribute viewer. We might need to add additional entity IDs based on those 4 values of the entity attribute. So the subject ID, pairwise ID, any, none being the 4 combinations, we'd have to work out how we'd handle that and whether we have some different entities in the federation to deal with that. But this is all stuff we can be getting on with. So the other thing is obviously then guidance for IDP and SP operators. So that's all the things we can think of right now, or I've thought of. I'd appreciate more thoughts on this and feedback from anyone. And that's me done. So thank you for listening. I'd appreciate any questions, comments, discussion from here. I can see the chat has been busy, so. So Alex has put a good link up for some of the commentary on eduperson principal name and eduperson targeted ID. Email addresses, yes, email addresses and identifiers used widely by commercial Saml implementations. Yes, it is, Neil. We know it's a bit of a it's a bit of a bugbear that happens a lot. Robert Bradley, yeah. Other in our case is username, which is not derived from names or systems of record like student HR. Oh, right, okay, yes. Right, okay, yeah, so good. Lots of people have put other, but they are generating values for those that are not based on, look to be based on names. It's good. Yes, Peter Shepherd's pointed out the object GUID from on-prem Active Directory to Azure AD. Yeah, because effectively you've just put your attributes in a different Active Directory. It's just Microsoft's big Active Directory rather than the one you have on site or whatever. Nick Myers, our SP have to move on. Okta. Yeah, so that case where you've talked about Okta, you know, if probably what you want to do is request that Okta build in this new subject identifier support. They should be supporting that in their SP. However, they should be checking the scopes of those. So that's an important piece that needs to be in there. It's not just blindly accepting the values. Okay, so Alex pointed out it's a superset of base 32, so I got that wrong. So you can use a hexadecimal UUID, including the hyphens, which is good. What value would you use to get a pairwise? So Christopher has asked, what value would you use to get used in a pairwise ID for a subject with both a student and employee number? Yeah, that's an interesting problem and not one we've covered here. Okay, yeah, and another comment that employee numbers and student numbers can change. So returners, merge of duplicates, etc. So yeah, you know, there's probably a need to have somewhere else in your identity management system how you define an attribute for people. So Robert says, is there any way to use base 62 for the newer type so we can retain base 64 for backwards compatibilities with existing SPs? And I think Alex has answered that one, but yes, that is the case. You just need 2 computed IDs or 2 stored IDs. Robert, I put no since we'd like to use the same as EPPN.
Is it possible you could go back to something like the 4th slide? I'd just like to copy it because there was something.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, we can certainly skip around to the slides. Let me go back to slide number 4. Was it?
Maybe 3rd one then.
That one there? No, wouldn't be that one.
4th one, it must be then. Thanks.
Isn't pairwise and subject already mandatory for supporting OIDC? I don't know. That's an interesting question. I've not touched OIDC massively. Where would I find the spec for the new Saml metadata for optional / required attributes? Okay, so it's an entity category. It is described, but in the standard, but it doesn't appear in. It doesn't appear as an XML block. When I was looking for examples for this to put it together, to try it out, to see how it worked, there are some imported into the UK Federation, but they might not be the best examples. I can certainly put an example together for you and pass that on. And we should probably just document what that is actually somewhere when we put the entity category up. So that was Christopher. Maintaining personalization will take some managing. We've had a number of users of notes on it. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think, this isn't going to move. This isn't going to move quickly. It's going to have to move slowly. I'm not sure what's wrong with old EPPN attributes. They do their job and do it well. Deprecating EPIDs seems like change for change's sake. It's in the specification what the problems are. I wonder if it'll be deprecated for a very long time as opposed to being got rid of straight away. Do you anticipate this transition will occur similar across IDPs belonging to other national federation members in Edugain? If RNS is a driver, research and scholarship, there's, I believe, more RNS support in a lot of other federations. So a lot of other IDPs are asserting research and scholarship. So I think it will be driven elsewhere as well. I don't think there's any other questions here. Did anyone else have any other comments? How many IDPs, SPs implement RNS though? I don't have that specific answer right now, but Alex has put a list up, 277. Anyone else wants to take the floor? My colleagues, they're very welcome to take the floor. Oh, 277 SPs that assert RNS, yes. Okay, I think the questions have sort of dried up. Has anyone got anything else to add?
John?
Yes.
It's Alex here, your colleague.
I can see you, it's fine.
I think given that have you got an opinion? Would you recommend that IDPs start releasing subject ID or pairwise ID right now, especially given that remote user ordering in the Shibboleth SP, because it looks like if you've got something that is set up as a targeted, that is personalized off targeted ID generating remote user, and your IDP starts generating a subject ID, that will then end up in remote user more preferentially than targeted ID.
Yes, however, the service provider has to register the entity category, and assuming the IDP only releases it based on the attribute filter that says you have to have that entity category, then it's not going to be released just openly. So it won't be released by default like EduPerson targeted ID is. It will be released when the service provider says, hey, I want to support this. So surely if the service provider says they want to support that, they need to be ready to do that. Obviously, that doesn't preclude them making a mistake and saying, we're ready to support this, but no, you're not.
So it would be safe for IDPs to start reconfiguring.
Yeah, I can't see any reason why it would be unsafe, assuming you use, the filter in, and I'll come back to it, but where is it there? That sort of filter. The only thing that is unsafe about that default, I would say at the moment, is the subject ID. If that has personal information in and you want to do additional logic around this to say, but you must say this, and also only for these SPs that I specifically want a list of entity IDs. That's on my list for examples, I think, for our site, because I think that's where we need to be, even if it's not quite with the standard. I think that's where we need to be. I don't think, even if the standard says one thing, and we need to make sure that people are not releasing personal information. That's more important than the standard, I guess. But we will document this value. We will document how to do this. We'll test how to do this so that you can have that sort of functionality. Okay. I don't think there's any more questions. So, Mark, do you want to? Should we draw to a close, or?
Yeah. Thank you everybody for coming. We'll make this, unless somebody emails me in the next 24 hours saying, please don't make this video available. We'll make it available towards the end of the week on the Federation website, or we'll link from the Federation website to wherever we store it. Thanks, John. Expert user polls as well. I think we had very good turnout. So clearly this is something we will obviously be coming back to in webinars, let alone obviously in the Federation activity. That's me done, John. You?
Yep, great. Thanks everyone for attending.